The biggest mistake they made that rainy night was believing quiet meant weak. Rain moved sideways through the harbor like silver threads unraveling beneath the cold Oregon sky. Fishing boats rocked softly against worn wooden docks while wind pushed the smell of salt water, diesel fuel, and wet cedar through the sleeping town. Most people had already gone home hours ago. The diner lights along Harbor Street dimmed one by one, and storefront windows reflected nothing but mist and empty sidewalks. But near the old bait shop at the edge of the marina, one man still sat quietly beneath a rusted awning as though he had nowhere urgent left to be. Daniel Hayes unfolded a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and ate slowly without speaking. His weathered flannel jacket carried the smell of seawater and sawdust from another long day repairing fishing nets for people who rarely asked many questions. At 45, Daniel had the kind of face life slowly reshaped instead of ruined. Short brown hair carried soft traces of gray near his temples, and lines around his eyes suggested years spent outdoors rather than years spent worrying. Most people in Harbor Point assumed he was just another lonely working man trying to stay afloat. Quiet, polite, forgettable, the kind of person people noticed only after he quietly disappeared. Beside him lay Ghost, a large German shepherd with black and tan fur darkened by rain. The dog rested calmly near Daniel's boots, head lifted, amber eyes quietly watching the empty harbor. Ghost never slept deeply in unfamiliar places, never fully relaxed. Daniel had learned long ago to trust the dog's instincts more than weather forecasts or first impressions, especially at night, especially around strangers. Daniel folded the empty sandwich wrapper neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Across the marina, thunder rolled low over the ocean. The storm would worsen before midnight. "Long day, buddy," he said softly. Ghost glanced toward him briefly, tail brushing once against the wet pavement before his attention shifted again toward the parking lot. Daniel noticed immediately. The dog's ears had changed position, slightly forward now. Focused, alert, not anxious, calculating. Daniel followed Ghost's line of sight. 3 men crossed the parking lot beneath the flickering glow of broken streetlights. Heavy boots, dark hooded jackets, loud voices bouncing carelessly against the quiet waterfront. Daniel recognized them. Everybody in Harbor Point knew who they were, even if most people pretended otherwise. The Calloway brothers. Or at least that was what locals called them, though only one of them actually shared the name. Small-time gangsters who spent most evenings collecting favors, intimidating struggling business owners, and reminding people exactly how uncomfortable life could become if they refused cooperation. Most folks simply looked away. Small towns sometimes survived on silence more than courage. Ghost sat upright now, completely still, watching every movement. Daniel reached down slowly and rested a hand against the dog's shoulder. Calm, steady. Ghost did not growl. He never wasted energy warning about things he had not measured yet. The 3 men stopped near an older fisherman locking supplies into the bait shop beside the dock. Daniel recognized him too. Walter Simmons, 73 years old. Bad knees. Widower. Friendly enough to offer free coffee to anybody working cold mornings on the harbor. Walter froze when the tallest man stepped closer. Even from across the dock, Daniel could hear the tension carried through voices sharpened by rain and frustration. "You are late again," one of them said. Walter answered quietly, hard to hear over the storm. The tallest man laughed. Not warmly. Ghost stood slowly now. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Easy," he said quietly. But he stayed seated, watching, listening. The thing people misunderstood about Daniel Hayes was that silence did not mean fear. Silence meant patience. It meant observation. It meant learning what mattered before deciding what deserved attention. Thunder rolled again. One of the men shoved Walter's tackle box with his boot, sending fishing tools scattering across wet pavement. Walter bent slowly, struggling against stiff knees to gather everything before the rain carried pieces toward the water. Ghost shifted his stance. Not aggression. Readiness. Daniel stood at last. Slow. Unhurried. The harbor wind tugged gently at his jacket while rain darkened his shoulders. He walked toward the dock with steady steps that somehow never felt rushed. The 3 men barely noticed him at first. Most people overlooked quiet men carrying tool belts instead of confidence. Daniel crouched beside Walter and picked up a rusted tackle knife before placing it gently back into the old fisherman's box. Evening. Walter, he said calmly. Walter looked relieved and nervous all at once. Daniel, he muttered quietly. Everything all right? Daniel asked softly. Before Walter could answer, the tallest man stepped forward. Mid-30s. Broad shoulders. Smirked too comfortable for decent conversation. Old man bothering you? He asked sarcastically. Daniel stood slowly. Rain dripped from the edge of his jacket. Ghost moved beside him without command, posture relaxed, but eyes locked carefully on every hand movement nearby. Daniel glanced once toward Walter, then back toward the group. Looks like everybody has had a long day, he said calmly. Maybe best to head home. For a moment, silence stretched strangely between them. Then one of the men laughed, loud enough for the harbor gulls to scatter overhead. You hear this? Another one said. The fisherman thinks he is sheriff now. The tallest man stepped closer. Too close. Rain slid between them in silver streaks while Ghost stood motionless at Daniel's side, watching with quiet intensity that somehow unsettled the space around him. Daniel never stepped backward, never raised his voice, never changed expression. But something shifted in the air anyway. Something difficult to explain, like the moment before lightning touches water. The tallest man looked briefly at Ghost, then back toward Daniel. You should mind your own business, he said. Daniel's voice stayed calm enough to almost disappear beneath the rain. I usually do. Ghost's ears tilted forward again. Somewhere deep in the storm-dark harbor, something invisible had already started changing. Some people carry storms inside them so quietly that the world mistakes their silence for weakness. Rain continued falling across Harbor Point long after the three men finally stepped away from Walter Simmons and disappeared into the dark parking lot, their laughter swallowed by harbor wind and distant thunder. Daniel Hayes never watched them leave for long. He simply bent back down, helped Walter gather the last few scattered fishing hooks, and closed the old tackle box with careful hands that moved slower than most men his age, but somehow steadier too. Ghost remained close, standing near Daniel's shoulder, ears still tilted toward the direction the men had gone. Watching, measuring, not afraid, never afraid. Walter rubbed rainwater from his face and exhaled heavily. You should not have stepped in, he muttered quietly. Those boys do not like being embarrassed. Daniel lifted the heavy tackle box and handed it back to him. Did not seem right leaving you out here alone. Walter gave a tired laugh without much humor. That is the problem around here, he said. Most people stopped caring what feels right. Daniel did not answer immediately. He rarely rushed words. Wind rattled loose ropes against nearby docks while fishing boats shifted softly against dark water below. Harbor Point always sounded lonelier after midnight, like the town itself had learned how to survive by speaking less. You heading home? Daniel finally asked. Walter nodded slowly. Truck still starts if the weather behaves. Daniel glanced toward the fisherman's rusted pickup parked beneath a flickering lamp. I will walk you over. Walter almost protested, then stopped when Ghost quietly moved ahead toward the truck without being told. The old fisherman smiled faintly. That dog always knows before everybody else. Daniel looked down briefly at Ghost. Yeah, he said softly. He usually does. 20 minutes later, the storm thickened over the harbor. Daniel and Ghost returned to the small, weather-beaten cabin they rented near the marina, tucked behind an abandoned crab warehouse where salt drifted through broken windows and gulls gathered before sunrise. The cabin had once belonged to a retired fisherman who passed years earlier, and now the owner's niece rented it cheaply because nobody else wanted a place so close to collapsing docks. Daniel never complained. He fixed broken boards when he noticed them, patched leaks himself, paid rent early when he could. Quiet men sometimes learned to survive by expecting very little. Inside, warmth came slowly. Ghost shook rainwater near the doorway before settling onto an old blanket beside the wood stove. Daniel added firewood, brewed black coffee, and stood silently at the small kitchen sink watching rain race across fogged windows. Most nights followed simple routines. Wake before sunrise. Repair fishing nets. Fix motors for struggling boat owners. Help older neighbors carry groceries or patch fences. Stay invisible. Harbor Point mostly left him alone. That suited Daniel fine. After enough years, quiet became easier than explaining yourself. Yet tonight felt different somehow. Something restless moved beneath the surface of the town. Ghost lifted his head suddenly from across the room. Ears forward. Daniel turned instinctively toward the window. Headlights moved slowly outside the cabin before stopping briefly near the road. Too slow for coincidence. Daniel waited without reacting. 30 seconds passed. Then the vehicle rolled away. Ghost relaxed slightly but stayed awake. Daniel poured coffee into an old, chipped mug. "Guess we made friends tonight," he said quietly. Ghost blinked once. Outside, thunder rolled over the ocean again. Morning arrived gray and cold. Harbor fog settled low enough to swallow half the fishing boats docked near the marina. Daniel already stood outside by 5 o'clock, repairing a damaged lobster cage while Ghost rested nearby, watching the harbor wake up. Nobody in town knew much about Daniel Hayes. They knew he worked hard, knew he spoke politely, knew he never drank too much at the harbor bar and never talked about where he lived before Harbor Point. But there were strange things people quietly noticed over time. Daniel always sat facing exits inside restaurants. He woke before dawn every day without fail. He noticed trouble before it arrived. And Ghost behaved less like an ordinary dog and more like a quiet partner who understood invisible things. By breakfast, whispers about the harbor incident had already started. Ruth at the diner leaned across the counter and smiled softly. "Heard you stood up to the Callaway boys." Daniel stirred cream into his coffee. "Would not call it standing up." "Still," Ruth said, lowering her voice. "People around here usually look away." Daniel glanced toward the harbor window where boats drifted beneath low fog. "Sometimes people just need somebody nearby." Ruth smiled gently. "World could use more men thinking like that." Ghost rested quietly beneath the booth, eyes half closed but ears still listening to every movement around them. Daniel reached down absent-mindedly and rubbed behind the dog's neck. "If you are enjoying stories about loyalty, mystery, and quiet strength," he said softly beneath his breath with the faintest tired smile, "do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss more stories worth staying for." Outside, near the diner parking lot, a dark pickup truck slowed just long enough for someone inside to watch through rain-covered glass before pulling away again. The strange thing about danger is that sometimes the quietest soul in the room notices it first. By late afternoon, Harbor Point carried the familiar rhythm of working people trying not to ask too many questions. Fishing boats drifted slowly against weathered docks while gulls circled overhead, their cries swallowed by ocean wind. The storm from the night before had passed, but gray clouds still clung low over the harbor like they had forgotten how to leave. Daniel Hayes spent most of the morning repairing torn fishing nets behind the marina warehouse, hands moving steadily beneath cold air that smelled faintly of salt and rust. Ghost rested nearby, stretched across old wooden planks beneath the dock awning, though anyone paying close attention would have noticed the dog never truly relaxed. His ears moved constantly. His eyes followed movement long before people arrived. Harbor Point called Ghost friendly. Daniel knew better. Ghost was observant, careful, patient. Around noon, Daniel packed his tools into the back of his old pickup truck and headed toward Ruth's diner for coffee before returning to work. The small diner sat near the harbor road, warm against the gray weather, its windows fogged softly from soup kettles and old conversations. Inside smelled like fried potatoes, fresh pie, and the kind of comfort lonely towns tried quietly to preserve. Ruth smiled when Daniel stepped through the door. "You still breathing after last night?" she asked kindly while pouring coffee before he even sat down. Daniel offered the faintest smile. "Seems that way." Ghost settled beside the booth immediately, calm but watchful, amber eyes quietly studying the room. Ruth lowered her voice slightly while wiping the counter. "People are talking." Daniel stirred cream into his coffee. "Small towns usually do." Ruth hesitated before leaning closer. "Callaway boys do not forget things easy." Daniel glanced toward the window where harbor fog drifted low across parked trucks. "Neither does weather," he said quietly. Ruth sighed softly, the kind older people do when they know advice probably will not change anything. Before she could say more, the diner door swung open hard enough for cold wind to rush inside. 3 men stepped in. Wet boots, heavy jackets, familiar faces. The same men from the harbor. Conversation inside the diner softened almost immediately. Not silence exactly, just caution. Harbor Point had learned survival through careful distance. Ghost lifted his head before Daniel even turned. Not alarmed. Focused. One of the men laughed loudly at something nobody else found funny, while another headed straight for the counter. The tallest one stopped halfway through the diner, when he noticed Daniel seated quietly near the window. His expression shifted, curious first, then amused. "Well," he said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Look who decided to come back." Daniel looked up slowly but did not answer. Ghost rose beside the booth without command. Calm posture, still body, eyes attentive. The tallest man stepped closer, rainwater still dripping from his jacket sleeves. "You always make it a habit sticking your nose where it does not belong." Daniel folded the napkin beside his plate carefully, mostly just trying to eat lunch. A few people glanced nervously toward Ruth behind the counter. The waitress busied herself wiping cups that were already clean. The tallest man laughed again, though something colder sat underneath it now. "You know," he said, leaning slightly against the table, "folks around here usually know better." Ghost shifted one step closer to Daniel's chair. Not aggressive, intentional, watching every movement. Daniel reached down absent-mindedly and rested one hand against the dog's neck. Calm, familiar, like two people sharing information nobody else noticed. "You should probably sit somewhere else," Daniel said quietly after a moment. "Rain has everybody in a bad mood." One of the younger men scoffed loudly. "Listen to this guy." But something strange happened then. The tallest man stopped smiling. His eyes flicked toward Ghost. The shepherd had not moved, had not growled, had not shown teeth. Yet there was something unsettling about the way he watched. Focused, measuring distance, reading movement before movement happened, like he had already calculated every possible outcome. The man shifted slightly without realizing he had done it. Daniel noticed. Ghost noticed first. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the ocean again. A waitress dropped silverware somewhere near the kitchen, and the sound startled half the room. The tallest man straightened slowly. "Funny dog," he muttered. Daniel took another sip of coffee. He is usually right about people. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then the younger guy near the door laughed awkwardly and nudged his friend. "Come on," he muttered. "Place smells like old soup anyway." The tallest man held Daniel's gaze 1 second longer before stepping back. "See you around," he said. Daniel nodded politely. "Probably." The men finally left, boots echoing against wet pavement outside. But Ghost did not settle back down. He stayed standing beside the booth, ears tilted toward the diner window. Watching, Daniel followed the dog's stare. Parked across the street beneath harbor fog sat the same dark pickup truck from earlier that morning. Engine running. Someone inside waiting. Sometimes trouble does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it parks quietly across the street and waits for somebody to look away first. Daniel Hayes finished his coffee slowly while Harbor Point drifted through another gray afternoon wrapped in ocean fog and cold wind. Outside Ruth's diner window, the dark pickup truck remained parked beneath the leaning cedar tree near the curb, engine humming softly, windshield streaked with rainwater. Nobody stepped out. Nobody waved. Yet Ghost never stopped watching it. The German shepherd stood beside the booth instead of settling beneath the table like usual, posture calm but alert, ears tilted toward the parking lot as though listening for something nobody else could hear. Daniel noticed every small change in the dog. He always had. Ghost only acted this way when something felt unfinished. Ruth returned carrying warm soup and fresh bread. She insisted Daniel take even when he said he was not hungry enough. "You keeping an eye on that truck too?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the window. Daniel glanced outside once. Hard not to notice. Ruth lowered her voice. "Been there nearly 20 minutes. Daniel stirred the soup slowly. "Maybe they like the weather." Ruth almost smiled but stopped herself. "Nobody likes this weather." Outside, gulls drifted low above the harbor while fishing boats creaked against wet docks. Harbor Point had the kind of silence people learned after years of keeping peace by avoiding trouble instead of confronting it. Daniel understood places like that. Towns where kindness stayed quiet because fear spoke louder. Ghost suddenly turned his head toward the diner entrance before the bell above the door even moved. 2 seconds later, it opened. Walter Simmons stepped inside looking damp and tired, jacket soaked from rain. His expression eased slightly when he spotted Daniel. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly. "Course not," Daniel said. Walter lowered himself into the booth with a slow sigh, rubbing cold hands together. "Had company earlier." Daniel looked up. Walter hesitated. "Those same boys came by the bait shop again." Ghost lifted his head immediately. Daniel stayed still. "Everything okay?" Walter nodded, though not convincingly. "Mostly just talking." He paused. "Asking questions about you." Daniel said nothing for several seconds. Outside, thunder rolled quietly above the harbor again. What kind of questions? Walter rubbed his jaw. Where you came from? How long you staying? Why your dog acts like he belongs in the military? Daniel almost smiled at that, though it disappeared quickly. What did you tell them? Walter shrugged. Truth mostly. He gave a tired laugh. That nobody knows much about Daniel Hayes. Ghost moved closer to Daniel's chair now, resting briefly against his leg before turning attention back toward the diner window. The dark pickup truck remained parked exactly where it had been. Engine still running. You know, Walter said carefully. Folks around here have learned not to ask questions. But people notice things. Daniel folded his napkin once. Like what? Walter hesitated again. Like how you always sit facing exits. Like how your dog watches hands before faces. Like how you never panic. Daniel looked toward the rain-covered glass. Bad habits from old jobs. Walter studied him quietly. You military? For a moment, only Rain answered. Daniel reached down and scratched gently behind Ghost's ears. Long time ago, he said softly. Before Walter could ask more, Ghost stood suddenly. Still. Focused. The dog's gaze locked toward the parking lot. Daniel followed it instinctively. The pickup truck door had opened. One of the men from the diner earlier stepped out into the rain. Hands inside jacket pockets. Slow walk. No hurry. He crossed the street without looking around much, like somebody trying too hard to seem casual. Ruth noticed too. I do not like this, she whispered behind the counter. Conversation inside the diner softened again as people quietly watched through coffee steam and fogged windows. The man stopped just outside the glass, glancing briefly inside before stepping toward the entrance. Ghost shifted position automatically between Daniel and the door. Calm. Silent. Ready. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. Easy, he said quietly. The diner bell rang overhead as the man stepped inside, rainwater dripping onto old hardwood floors. He smiled, though warmth never reached his eyes. Afternoon, he said casually. Nobody answered immediately. He looked directly at Daniel. Mind if we talk outside for a minute? Daniel stayed seated. About what? The man shrugged. My boss thinks maybe there was a misunderstanding at the harbor. Ghost never blinked. The man noticed the dog watching him and shifted his weight slightly. Small movement. Nervous without meaning to be. Daniel saw it immediately. Ghost had already noticed. Outside, wind rattled diner windows while Harbor Point seemed to hold its breath. Daniel finally stood. Slow. Calm. He slipped money beneath the coffee cup and nodded once toward Ruth and Walter. I will be right back, he said quietly. Walter looked worried. Ruth looked ready to argue. Ghost moved instantly beside Daniel, shoulder brushing his leg as they headed toward the door together. Rain waited outside. So did something heavier than weather. Rain felt colder outside the diner than it had only minutes earlier, the kind of cold that slipped quietly beneath jackets and settled into old memories before anyone noticed. Daniel Hayes stepped onto the wet sidewalk without hurry, Ghost moving beside him so naturally it almost looked rehearsed. The man from the pickup waited near the curb beneath gray harbor light, hands still tucked inside his jacket pockets while rain gathered at the edges of his hood. Cars rolled slowly along Harbor Street, tires hissing softly against wet pavement. Across the marina, gulls drifted low through fog as fishing boats rocked gently against old wooden docks. Harbor Point moved carefully around trouble. People noticed it, then pretended not to. Daniel stopped several feet away. Enough distance to speak. Enough distance to think. Ghost positioned himself quietly at Daniel's side, body relaxed, but eyes never leaving the stranger's hands. Calm. Patient. Watching. The man gave an awkward smile. Appreciate you stepping outside. Daniel nodded once. You said there was a misunderstanding. The man glanced briefly toward the diner window where Ruth and Walter still watched through fogged glass. My boss just wants to clear the air. Daniel waited. Silence had a way of making nervous people speak faster. The man shifted his weight. You embarrassed some people down at the harbor last night. Daniel looked toward the ocean briefly before answering. Did not realize helping an old fisherman counted as embarrassing. The stranger forced a short laugh that disappeared quickly. Look, nobody wants problems. Ghost's ears tilted slightly forward. Daniel noticed. Small detail. The man's left hand had not moved once since coming outside. Hidden too carefully inside the jacket pocket. Not threatening exactly. Just uncomfortable. Daniel had spent enough years around tension to recognize rehearsed confidence. Then why follow me? Daniel asked calmly. The man hesitated. Maybe because people around town are curious. He paused. You move different. Daniel said nothing. Rain tapped softly against the diner windows behind them. Funny thing, the stranger continued carefully. Folks say your dog acts military. Ghost remained perfectly still. People say lots of things, Daniel replied. The man laughed again, though less comfortably now. You military? Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering quietly. Long time ago. Harbor wind pushed harder through the street, rattling loose signs near the marina. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Ghost turned his head sharply toward the end of the block. Daniel followed instinctively. A delivery truck moved too quickly around the harbor corner, skidding slightly on slick pavement before fishtailing toward the sidewalk. Across the street, an older woman carrying grocery bags froze near the crosswalk, unable to move fast enough. The truck driver struggled for control. Tires screamed softly against wet asphalt. People shouted from nearby storefronts. Everything happened fast after that. Faster than most people could think. Daniel moved before anybody else fully understood the danger. Calm. Direct. No panic. He crossed the street with quick, steady strides, voice suddenly clear and firm in a way Harbor Point had never heard before. Ma'am, he called sharply, step left now. Something about the tone made people listen. The woman moved instantly without thinking. Ghost ran ahead beside Daniel, positioning near the curb as if already reading the truck's path. Daniel reached the woman just as the vehicle corrected direction and rolled safely past, missing the curb entirely before slowing several yards away. No crash. No disaster. Just frightened breathing and shaken nerves. The woman stood trembling slightly while Daniel steadied her grocery bags. You all right? He asked quietly, voice soft again now. She nodded weakly. I think so. Around them, people slowly emerged from shops and sidewalks. Harbor workers. Diners. Strangers. Walter stood near the diner entrance, staring openly now. Even Ruth had stepped outside. Something unspoken moved through the crowd. Not fear. Recognition. Daniel had reacted too quickly. Too precisely. The kind of calm that did not belong to ordinary dock workers. Ghost stood nearby watching the truck driver carefully until the danger passed, then quietly returned to Daniel's side without command. The man from the pickup truck had gone completely silent. How did you? He started, stopping halfway through the sentence. Daniel handed the older woman her grocery. The truth about certain men is that you only notice who they really are after something unexpected forces them to stop hiding. Rain finally eased sometime after sunset, leaving Harbor Point wrapped in cold mist and quiet streets that smelled faintly of salt water and wet cedar. Word traveled faster than weather in towns this small. By evening, people had already started quietly retelling what happened near the diner. The quiet harbor repairman, who somehow moved before anyone else. The old woman who could have been seriously hurt if someone had not acted quickly. The strange calm. The dog that seemed to know where danger would land before it happened. Nobody said much directly to Daniel Hayes, but people looked at him differently now. Not afraid. Curious. Careful. Like they had realized there might be chapters in his life nobody understood yet. Daniel returned to the harbor after dinner, tools packed in the bed of his truck, while Ghost sat beside him beneath cold gray skies, turning darker over the ocean. Fishing nets still needed repairing before morning. Life did not pause just because people started asking questions. Harbor lights reflected softly across black water while boats drifted quietly against old docks. Daniel worked steadily beneath the marina awning, replacing worn rope and checking damaged metal hooks under a hanging work lamp that buzzed softly in the mist. Ghost rested nearby, but never fully settled. Every few minutes, his ears shifted toward passing vehicles along Harbor Road. Watching. Listening. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. Around 8 o'clock, Sheriff Miles Brennan pulled into the marina parking lot. Older man. Early 60s. Broad shoulders softened by age and long winters. The sheriff climbed from his truck carrying 2 paper coffee cups and the kind of expression people wore when they had been thinking too much. Thought you could use something warm, he said quietly. Daniel accepted the coffee with a small nod. Appreciate it. Miles glanced toward Ghost, who acknowledged him with one calm look before returning attention toward the harbor. That dog still remembers me. the sheriff said with a faint smile. Daniel paused slightly while tightening rope through the fishing net. Guess he does. The sheriff looked at him carefully then. Funny thing, he said. I was not expecting to run into you here. Daniel said nothing at first. Wind brushed softly against the docks. Somewhere farther down the marina, chains rattled quietly against boat railings. Been a while, Daniel finally said. Miles gave a short laugh beneath his breath. 15 years, maybe. He shook his head slowly. Though back then everybody called you Commander Hayes. Daniel's hand stopped moving for only half a second. Almost impossible to notice unless someone knew him well. Ghost lifted his head immediately. The sheriff looked toward the ocean before speaking again. Did not recognize you at first, Miles admitted. Not until today. Daniel leaned back slightly against the workbench, coffee warming tired hands. People change. Sure, Miles said quietly. But not the kind of calm you showed today. Silence stretched between them for a while. Comfortable somehow. Old memories rarely rush themselves. Finally, Miles lowered his voice. You know the Calloway boys have been asking questions? Daniel nodded once. Seems that way. The sheriff sighed heavily. Those men mistake quiet for weakness. Always have. He hesitated. You planning on telling folks who you really are? Daniel looked out across the dark harbor. Fishing boats drifted gently beneath mist while distant lighthouse beams moved slowly across water. No reason to, he said softly. That life ended a long time ago. Miles folded his arms against the cold. Maybe for you. He glanced toward Ghost. But men do not forget dogs like that either. Daniel looked down at Ghost briefly. The shepherd sat calmly beside the dock entrance, posture straight, gaze fixed toward the parking lot. Focused again. Sheriff Miles noticed too. Something wrong. Daniel followed the dog's stare. Headlights approached slowly through fog near the marina entrance. The same dark pickup truck rolled into view and parked 20 yards away without shutting off the engine. Daniel exhaled softly through his nose. Guess we are still popular. Miles frowned immediately. Those boys. Daniel shrugged lightly. Would not surprise me. The sheriff took one step forward before stopping. Want me to handle this? Daniel remained calm. Not unless somebody needs help. Ghost stood slowly now. Alert but controlled. Watching the truck. Waiting. The driver's door finally opened. This time, the tallest man stepped out alone. No laughter now. No smirk either. Just measured steps across wet pavement toward the marina lights. Sheriff Miles straightened slightly. You know him? Daniel asked quietly. Name is Mason Calloway, Miles muttered. Thinks fear makes him important. Mason stopped several feet away, hands visible this time. Careful. Studying Daniel with a different expression now. Less mocking. More uncertain. So, Mason said quietly, glancing between Daniel and the sheriff. I hear people forgot to mention who you used to be. Harbor wind moved softly across the docks while Ghost stood beside Daniel without blinking. For the first time since arriving in Harbor Point, the silence around Daniel Hayes no longer felt ordinary. Mist rolled low across Harbor Point Marina while the ocean breathed quietly beyond the docks. Dark water shifting beneath cold moonlight and the distant sound of gulls settling for the night. Mason Calloway stopped several feet from Daniel Hayes, hands visible now, posture careful in a way it had not been before. Something had changed. Fear had not arrived exactly, but certainty had left the room. Sheriff Miles Brennan stood nearby beneath the marina light, arms folded against the cold while Ghost remained beside Daniel. Perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on Mason with calm patience that somehow unsettled the silence around them. Daniel leaned lightly against the workbench where torn fishing nets still waited unfinished, warm coffee cooling untouched near his tools. He looked less like somebody dangerous and more like a tired dock worker who wanted a quiet evening. Yet Harbor Point had started noticing something different now. The stillness around him no longer felt ordinary. Mason cleared his throat softly. Funny thing, he said, glancing briefly toward Ghost before looking back at Daniel. Nobody ever mentioned Commander Hayes' work down at the docks. Daniel's expression never changed much. Because that is not who I am anymore. Wind shifted across the harbor, rattling loose rope against wooden poles. Somewhere farther down the marina, a boat engine turned over once before falling silent again. Sheriff Miles watched Mason carefully, but stayed quiet. Daniel had already made it clear he did not want rescuing. Mason shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets before seeming to remember Ghost was watching every movement. Slowly, awkwardly, he pulled them back out. "Look," he said. There was some misunderstanding. Daniel stayed still. "You said that already." Mason hesitated. "People around here get protective of business." Daniel glanced toward the ocean briefly. "Threatening old fishermen is business now." Sheriff Miles almost smiled at that, though he hid it quickly beneath a cough. Mason looked uncomfortable. More uncomfortable than angry. "Walter owes money," he muttered. "Folks owe money sometimes." Daniel folded the edge of the fishing net calmly between weathered hands. "People still deserve respect." For several seconds, only harbor wind answered. Mason shifted weight again. Ghost noticed before anyone else. The shepherd stood a little straighter but remained calm. No growl. No tension. Just focus. Daniel rested one hand gently against the dog's shoulder. Familiar. Grounding. "Listen," Mason said finally, lowering his voice. "My brothers got carried away." He glanced toward the sheriff. "Nobody wants problems with military people." Daniel almost sighed at that. "I am not military people." He looked directly at Mason for the first time in several minutes. Calm eyes. Tired eyes. Older than the rain somehow. "I fix fishing nets." Mason frowned slightly, confused by the answer. "That is it." Daniel shrugged once. "That is enough." Sheriff Miles leaned against a piling nearby. "You should probably hear what he is not saying," he muttered quietly. Mason glanced toward him. Miles nodded once toward Daniel. "He is telling you to stop, while everybody still gets to go home." The marina lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere out beyond the fog, a buoy bell rang through dark water. Harbor Point felt strangely suspended between weather and memory. Mason looked at Ghost again. The dog never blinked. "Dog military too?" he asked awkwardly. Daniel scratched gently behind Ghost's ear. "Ghost used to work harder than me." That answer unsettled Mason even more. Not because it sounded threatening. Because Daniel said it without pride. Without ego. Like somebody discussing an old chapter already packed away years ago. People who bragged about strength usually wanted witnesses. Quiet people rarely did. Finally, Mason stepped backward once. Then again. "All right," he muttered. "No reason to make things worse." Daniel nodded politely. "Good." Mason paused halfway back toward the truck. "You really were Navy SEAL?" Sheriff Miles answered before Daniel could. "Commander," he said simply. Mason swallowed hard enough to notice. And nobody thought to mention that. Miles gave the faintest smile. Nobody asked the right questions. Daniel picked up the fishing net again like the conversation had already ended. Calm. Ordinary. Unimpressed by his own history. Ghost finally relaxed half an inch, though his eyes followed Mason all the way back toward the pickup truck. The engine started moments later. Tires rolled slowly across wet pavement before disappearing into harbor fog. Silence settled again over the marina. Sheriff Miles exhaled quietly. That probably went better than expected. Daniel tied another section of damaged rope. People usually calm down when somebody finally listens. Miles looked toward him carefully. "You know this is not over, right?" Daniel nodded once. "Most things are not." The sheriff stayed a moment longer before setting an extra flashlight beside the workbench. "Call me if trouble changes its mind." Then he headed back toward his truck. Alone again beneath the harbor lights, Daniel continued repairing nets while Ghost rested nearby, though neither of them fully relaxed. Not yet. Across town, Harbor Point whispered quietly through diner counters and dockside conversations. The quiet repairman was not just quiet. The strange dog was not ordinary. And somewhere inside those growing whispers lived one uncomfortable truth the Calloway brothers had finally begun to understand. The man they thought was easy to push had spent an entire lifetime surviving storms much larger than them. The strange thing about fear is that once people stop pretending not to see it, truth usually arrives not long afterward. Harbor Point woke beneath thick ocean fog the next morning, the kind that swallowed fishing boats whole until only distant horns and gull cries reminded people the harbor still existed somewhere beyond the mist. Rain had finally stopped, but cold air lingered across the docks like unfinished conversation. By sunrise, nearly everyone in town had heard some version of the same story. The quiet repairman was not just some lonely drifter fixing nets near the marina. The sheriff had called him Commander Hayes. Ghost was not simply a loyal dog. And somehow, the men who spent years making Harbor Point nervous had suddenly grown quieter themselves. Daniel Hayes paid little attention to any of it. By 6 o'clock, he already stood near the marina repairing a broken winch motor for an older fisherman whose hands shook too much for mechanical work these days. Ghost rested nearby beside the toolbox, watching gulls circle low through fog, while fishermen moved carefully around wet docks preparing for another cold morning on the water. "You know," the fisherman muttered while tightening his coat, "folks are saying you were some kind of war hero." Daniel wiped grease from his hands onto an old cloth. "Folks say a lot of things." The man smiled softly. "That means yes." Daniel almost smiled back. "Mostly means I am old enough to avoid arguments." The fisherman laughed quietly. "Still helped Walter." Daniel shrugged once. "Anybody should have. But the truth about kindness is that people notice it most when they have forgotten what it looks like." By noon, Harbor Point carried a strange energy. Less fear, more watching. Small business owners who usually stayed quiet had started talking carefully to one another. Ruth overheard whispers inside the diner. Walter stood taller than usual near the bait shop. Even people who normally crossed the street to avoid trouble suddenly looked toward the Calloway brothers differently now. Not brave exactly, just less afraid. Fear changes shape once somebody proves it is not permanent. Daniel finished work near lunch and headed toward Harbor Street with Ghost beside him, stopping first at the hardware store for rope and boat supplies. The owner, an older woman named Claire, handed him an extra box of nails he had not paid for. "On the house," she said softly. Daniel frowned slightly. "You do not need to do that." Claire folded her arms. "You reminded people around here what decent looks like." Daniel hesitated before accepting quietly. "Thank you." Outside, Ghost stopped near the sidewalk and lifted his head suddenly. Ears forward. Focused. Daniel noticed immediately. Across the street, a dark sedan had parked near the marina entrance. Not the same pickup truck this time. Different vehicle. Cleaner. Tinted windows. Two men stepped out wearing plain jackets that somehow looked official without trying too hard. Ghost watched carefully but remained calm. One of the men approached slowly. Mid-40s. Clean haircut. Serious expression softened by exhaustion rather than arrogance. "Daniel Hayes?" the man asked. Daniel nodded once. The stranger reached into his coat slowly enough for Ghost to stay relaxed before showing identification. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Daniel's expression changed very little. "Can I help you?" The man glanced briefly toward Harbor Point behind them before lowering his voice. "Actually, we were hoping you might help us." Daniel stayed quiet. The agent continued. "We have been investigating extortion tied to harbor businesses for over a year." He paused. Calloway operation kept slipping through. Daniel looked toward the water. "Sounds like sheriff business." "Normally," the agent admitted. "But word reached us this morning that somebody finally disrupted their routine." Daniel almost sighed. "I fixed a fishing net." The second agent smiled slightly beneath tired eyes. "And apparently convinced half the town to stop being afraid." Ghost stood calmly beside Daniel, though his gaze drifted briefly toward Harbor Street. 2 blocks away, parked outside an old warehouse near the marina, Mason Calloway stood smoking beside another truck. Watching, Daniel noticed him immediately. The agents noticed too. "You do not need to get involved," the first agent said carefully. "Truthfully, your name showing up again surprised us." Daniel folded his hands inside his jacket pockets against the cold wind. "That chapter ended years ago." The agent nodded respectfully. "We understand." Then he hesitated. "Still, men like Calloway count on people staying silent." Harbor fog moved gently across the street between them. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang softly through the mist. Daniel glanced down at Ghost, who stood calm as ever, patient and steady beneath the gray sky. Then he looked back toward the harbor, where Harbor Point kept trying to remember what courage felt like. "People should not have to live scared," he said quietly. Across the street, Mason Calloway looked away first. "Sometimes peace arrives quietly, not because trouble disappears, but because good people finally remember they are stronger together than fear ever allowed them to believe." Harbor Point changed slowly after that cold week by the ocean. Not overnight. Small towns rarely healed that way. But things shifted in quiet places first. The bait shop stopped closing early. Ruth at the diner no longer glanced nervously toward the windows every time unfamiliar trucks parked outside. Fishermen stood longer at the marina without lowering their voices whenever certain names came up. Fear had not vanished. It had simply lost some of its power. Federal investigators returned twice during the following weeks. Questions got asked. Financial records surfaced. Harbor business owners quietly began speaking about things they had ignored for years. Nobody in town celebrated. Harbor Point had learned long ago that healing moved slower than storms. Yet people noticed something strange. Mason Calloway and his brothers stopped lingering around the docks. The loud trucks disappeared from Harbor Street. Even the tension inside the diner softened. Nobody said much about why. Sometimes justice arrives loud. Sometimes it simply arrives on time. Daniel Hayes never took credit for any of it. Most mornings still began the same way. Up before sunrise. Coffee black and simple. Work gloves pulled on while cold harbor wind moved through fog-covered docks. Ghost beside him always. Older wisdom resting quietly inside watchful amber eyes. Daniel repaired nets. Fixed engines. Helped older fishermen carry heavy supplies without making a moment feel like charity. Life stayed ordinary because Daniel wanted it that way. Harbor Point respected that. Yet something changed in how people looked at him now. Not with fear. Not even admiration exactly. More like trust. The kind earned slowly. One afternoon near the end of winter, Walter Simmons stopped by the marina carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "You work too much," he muttered while handing one over. Daniel smiled faintly. Thought old fishermen liked hard work. Walter laughed softly before glancing toward Ghost, who sat nearby watching gulls circle low over the harbor. "Town likes that dog almost as much as they like you." Daniel looked down at Ghost briefly. "Pretty sure they like him more." Walter nodded like that sounded reasonable. Fair enough. Across Harbor Point, people had quietly started calling Ghost the harbor guardian. Children stopped to pet him after school. Shop owners kept dog treats behind counters without asking permission first. Older veterans passing through town somehow noticed him differently too. Sometimes they sat beside Ghost outside Ruth's diner for long, quiet minutes without saying much. Daniel understood that kind of silence. Sometimes healing happened best without conversation. One gray afternoon, nearly 3 months after the harbor confrontation, Sheriff Miles Brennan walked onto the dock carrying an old photograph sealed carefully inside an envelope. "Thought you should have this," he said quietly. Daniel opened it slowly. The picture showed a much younger Daniel standing beside Ghost years earlier. Both soaked from ocean spray. Military uniforms. Tired smiles. Harder eyes than now. Written softly across the back in faded ink were simple words. "Good men survive war. Great men learn peace." Daniel stood quietly for a long moment. Harbor wind moved softly around them. "Forgot this existed," he admitted. Miles leaned against the railing. "People around here forget you were somebody important." Daniel folded the picture carefully and slipped it inside his jacket. Everybody was somebody before life changed. Miles smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not everybody comes out kinder." By spring, Harbor Point felt lighter somehow. Boats returned more often. Business slowly improved. The harbor laughed again in small ways. One evening, Daniel closed up work just before sunset and walked toward the diner with Ghost beside him. Sky painted soft orange over the water while fishing boats drifted quietly toward home. Ruth waved them inside before they even reached the door. "Usual table," she called warmly. Family sat eating pie. Fishermen traded stories near the counter. Nobody lowered their voice when Daniel entered anymore. Nobody looked nervous. For the first time in years, the town felt like somewhere people could breathe again. Later that night, Daniel stood near the marina watching moonlight stretch across calm water while Ghost rested beside him. Wind moved gently through the harbor, carrying salt and quiet memories. "Guess we stayed longer than planned," Daniel said softly. Ghost looked up once, tail brushing lightly against the dock. Daniel rested one hand against the dog's neck and stared toward the lighthouse, blinking steadily against the dark. He had survived war. Survived loneliness too. Yet somehow, peace turned out to be the harder thing to trust. Harbor Point had not saved him exactly, but maybe it reminded him something important. Strength did not always look loud. Sometimes strength looked like staying kind after life gave you every reason not to. And sometimes, the strongest men in the room were the ones quiet enough to walk away when they no longer had anything left to prove.